In August 2013, a PR-conscious pontiff posed for a selfie with some cell phone-wielding teenagers. The resulting image, with its telling conjunction of youth and age, contemporaneity and tradition, tells us quite a lot about the state of photography today. Not just about a particular genre of image, which this example of course confirms as the fashionable pose of the moment, but also about the schizophrenic character of the photograph in general. This photograph was of course taken with a camera incorporated into a multimedia communications device. As a consequence, the photograph was taken not to be printed, but to be exchanged with friends all around the world, of course including in Australia and New Zealand. There's no such thing as national boundaries in photography anymore, mainly by being uploaded onto social media. If this one is a guide, it seems the vernacular photograph has become a stream of electronic signals intended to represent an entirely momentary and semi-public exclamation of a presence in the present, rather than, as in the past, a certification of that has been. Capable of shifting shape and identity in the blink of an eye, photography has always encompassed both material and immaterial manifestations, both physical objects grounded in specific configurations of time and space, and apparitional images floating free of any particular substrate and capable of endless reproduction in a variety of media and formats. But now the apparitional version of the photograph seems to have conquered all. The photograph, it seems, is now nothing but image. More exactly, the photograph now comprises an unrelenting torrent of such images. Daniel hesitated to give you statistics, but unfortunately, because you've forgotten what he had to tell you, I'm going to give you some. Facebook launched, it seems like a millennium ago, but in fact only in February 2004, has reported that on average about 136,000 photographic images are uploaded onto their site every minute, with over 250 million, he said 350 million, but given the numbers we're talking about, the odd 100 million hardly counts, about 250 million photographs uploaded per day. This means that the site gains about 91 billion new images per year for a current total of about 350 billion photographic images in total. Flickr, an image-sharing website also established in February 2004, in this case by a Vancouver-based company, is now host to at least 4 billion images, with about 4,500 new ones being uploaded every minute. The numbers seem overwhelming. How can we possibly grasp such an avalanche of photographic images? How can we make a meaningful or even representative selection from them? How can we, in good conscience, present these repetitive, banal, overwhelmingly conformist images in an art context? These questions point to the difficulty of representing contemporary vernacular photography in an art museum, an institution traditionally fixated on static objects, preferably rare, innovative, and/or significant ones. In her current exhibition in the International Centre of Photography, also mentioned by Daniel, Public, Private, Secret, curator Charlotte Cotton chose to address this problem by including a number of digital screens that are constantly streaming images from the internet according to certain prescribed search terms: hotness, seeking this person, transgender, among them. This, as Daniel mentioned, didn't meet the approval of the critic writing for The Guardian in London on June 27. Quote, "If ICP wants to turn its back on art history and on its own collection, and conceive of all images as equally valid elements of one giant image stream, that's its prerogative. But then do something with that vision. Don't junk art history just to reproduce the web. The role of a 21st century photography museum should be to analyse, synthesise and historicise our understanding of today's dispensation of images, rather than just to replicate the products of the search engine and the hashtag. A museum, this museum, must be so much more than an aggregator, more than a collection of JPEGs to be fleetingly contemplated before we swipe past," unquote. So what is a museum to do? How can curators analyse, synthesise and historicise the contemporary photographic image? Fortunately, as again Daniel's already mentioned, there are quite a few artists who are already doing that, in effect performing the work of the curator and thus allowing the museum to present this phenomenon in a physical form. The Dutch designer-artist Erik Kessels, for example, has set out to make visible, even touchable, the otherwise sublimely incomprehensible numbers that I've already cited. In 2013, Kessels organised to print out all of the free and accessible images uploaded to the Flickr website in a single 24-hour period, supposedly about 1 million images. What you're actually seeing in the gallery, though, is about 350,000 of those images carefully arranged over a wooden armature so as to physically represent what would be the volume of the total download if, in fact, that full volume had been printed. So it's a bit of a gimmick, but at least this kind of installation helps to make palpable the sheer scale of contemporary photography today. The work is a kind of sculptural monument to our obsession with the taking and sharing of bad photographs. Here's a handsome stranger recording it. But what the work doesn't do is offer us any insight into the actual photographs themselves. Fortunately, though, the work of Joachim Schmid does just that. Between 2008 and 2011, this German artist spent 6 hours a day grabbing selected images from Flickr and then using them to illustrate 96 of his own artist's books under the generic title, Other People's Photographs. When I once asked him why, he told me, "I do it so that you don't have to." And in the process, of course, he's kindly provided curators with a kind of anecdotal, almost surrealist ethnography of global snapshot photography today. These books can be bought online or perused in a gallery installation like this one. As the artist's website declares, each book is comprised of images that focus on a specific photographic event or idea, the grouping of photographs revealing recurring patterns in modern popular photography. The approach is encyclopedic, and the number of volumes is virtually endless but arbitrarily limited. The selection of themes is neither systematic nor does it follow any established criteria. The project structure, then, mirrors the multifaceted, contradictory, and chaotic practice of modern photography itself, based exclusively on the motto, "You can observe a lot by watching." It's become a truism to remark on the refashioning of privacy in our digital age, with social media stretching the word friend to now include a vast array of relative strangers. Schmidt's unauthorized publication of Flickr photographs merely extends this array to include discriminating denizens of the art and book collecting world. Here's Big Fish, and here's 2 double pages from the same book. How then did he actually make these books? Sitting at his computer screen, Schmid downloaded certain subjects and motifs that seemed to recur in the constant stream of photographs that he saw on Flickr's most recent uploads page, which he refreshed once a second. Of course, there are now sites that set out to facilitate this same sort of distillation process, such as Pinterest, a social media website launched in 2010, on which its 12 million users compile collections of pictures that they find on the internet and that, for whatever reason, they think are interesting. But Schmid surely brings a distinctively ironic eye, embodied in his deadpan titles, mugshots, not what you'd expect, and the play of chance to this same process. He finds his images rather than searching for them by word, for example, thus allowing us to take note of exhibitionist desires that might otherwise remain scattered and lost in the infinity of digital space. In short, each of his 32-page samplers imposes a thematic unity on an otherwise unruly universe of images. For one such book, Schmid gathered about 10,000 images of currywurst, the local fast food of his hometown of Berlin, lovingly photographed by those unlucky souls about to consume it. He's told me again that after a lifetime spent gathering discarded analogue photographs, he'd previously found only a handful of similar images. Thus, even within the apparent global homogeneity of Flickr, we can find the viral traces of the local asserting themselves, if, that is, we care to look for them. In fact, it is only Schmidt's looking that turns this otherwise international genre, food photography, into a regional, perhaps even an autobiographical focal point. Indeed, it might be said that a collapsing of the global into the personal is at the heart of his practice, making it a reflection on the peculiar character of social media itself. One of his last books comprises nothing but photographs of the photographer's shadow. What's interesting about this subject matter is that all of these shadow pictures seem to have been deliberately made, a significant change in this long-established amateur practice. And perhaps this change is influenced by the incorporation in the 1960s of shadows into the work of art photographers like Lee Friedlander. If so, here on Flickr we get to see the art world which once upon a time mimicked the so-called snapshot aesthetic, now having that mimicry reabsorbed back into vernacular practice. Among other things, Schmidt's project notes the sudden popularity of entirely new genres of images, such as the proliferation on Flickr of images of camera boxes, apparently now the first thing everyone takes with their new camera. And then uploads, notice, not just takes, but for whatever reason, uploads. Of course, as we've already seen, the next thing you're likely to take is a selfie. Schmidt's book on this genre implies that there are many more young photographers doing this than those over 30, and many more women than men. His selection also leaves the impression that this practice is more popular in Japan than in other countries, although, as he admits, this could be because Japanese teenagers uploaded their files onto Flickr as he started work in Germany, whereas American members uploaded while he was asleep. In Korea, this kind of photograph has a different name, selka, meaning self-camera. The Korean scholar Jung Joon Lee reports that many young women who practice selka adopt specific angles and facial expressions, there are magazines telling them how to do it, that are designed to give them bigger eyes, a higher nose bridge, and a smaller face. But this kind of specificity and a critical engagement with the Orientalism it internalizes is subsumed in Schmidt's book to the startling conformity of the genre, to a blithe repetition of form that appears to obey no identifiable cultural imperative beyond narcissism. Here then is the curatorial project that his project lays before us, not just to make sense of contemporary photography, but to find ways to creatively intervene within it, not just to wonder at its numbing sameness, but also to exacerbate into visibility the abrasive political economy of difference that lurks just beneath its banal surfaces. Another artist who creates composites out of images found on the internet, the American Penelope Umbrico, makes work that might be best regarded as a hybrid of the approaches of Kessels and Schmid. Here's an installation view of her sons from Flickr from 2006-2007. This project started when she found 541,795 pictures of sunsets while looking for Flickr's most photographed subject, which the sunset turned out to be. She then took just the suns from these pictures and then made hundreds of prints of them, exhibiting them, as you can see, as a vast grid of pictorial sameness and difference. For each installation of the work, her title reflects the number of hits that she got when she searched sunset on Flickr at the time. So 541,795 in 2006, 2,303,057 in 2007, 3,221,717 in 2008, 5,911,253 in 2009, and so on and so forth. Thus, the title itself becomes a kind of comment on the hyperbolic expansion of online photo sharing, as well as a wry reflection on the nature of the collective content found there. As the artist has said, and I quote, "I think it's peculiar that the sun, the quintessential life giver, constant in our lives, symbol of enlightenment, spirituality, eternity, all things unreachable and ephemeral, omnipotent provider of warmth, optimism, and vitamin D, and so universally photographed, finds expression on the internet, the most virtual of spaces, equally infinite but within a closed electrical circuit. Looking into this cool electronic space, one finds a virtual window onto the natural world." And as with Schmidt's books, Umbrico's installations highlight the uneasy play vernacular photography engineers between personal choice and collective compulsion, between uplift and kitsch, between individuality and conformity. A similar work from 2010, and I'm just, of course, just sampling these artists' works, comprised a collection of cropped and enlarged images of TV sets that Umbrico found listed for sale on Craigslist, the Trade Me of the United States. When you look closely, you can see hints of the seller's own domestic interior reflected in the glass of the sets themselves, making these photographs both deadpan documents of a now defunct technology and inadvertent self-portraits, announced in each case by the reflected flash of the camera that took them. Once again, the generic is made personal and the personal is made generic. What else can you do with the infinite archive of photographic images found on the internet? How else can they be curated? Well, in his Googlegrams made in 2005, the Spanish artist Joan Fontcuberta, who has some earlier work, of course, in emanations, produced a series of photomosaics using photo imaging freeware and Google's image search engine to recreate popular media images. The software program selects each graphic sample from the bank of available images on the internet and places it according to chromatic value and density in the position that most closely coincides with a portion of a larger image being recreated, as if it's making a gigantic jigsaw puzzle. The greater the number of cells, the sharper the resulting image will be. As you can see, one of those photomosaics formed a copy of the widely disseminated photographic images from the infamous torture scandal that took place in the Abu Ghraib prison in Baghdad in 2005. We see, once again, the American soldier, Private Lindy England, holding a leash tied around the neck of a prisoner as if he were a dog. To make this composite, Fontcuberta fed the search engine the names of the top officials, civilian contractors, and enlisted soldiers cited in the congressional report on this atrocity set up by the US Congress to investigate the alleged abuses. In other words, the image we see is composed of all the people actually responsible for this atrocity, from President Bush and Dick Cheney down to Private England herself. At a certain distance, the photomosaic presents us with a perfectly recognisable picture of Private England, but as we move closer, we find photos, drawings, caricatures, graphics, and so on, all of them found through these word searches of these responsible names in this report. In other words, a host of images associated in some way with each of the names supplied for the search. What we have here then is a palimpsest effect of overlapping texts whose hierarchy is solely dependent on the observer's distance. A distant vision privileges the composite whole, while a myopic view privileges the little component units that make up the coarse graphic texture. And I think it's important to Fontcuberta's work that it remains coarse rather than indeed refined. The creative weight of the work then derives from the relationship established between the content of the primary image and that of the search terms. And we are made complicit on deciding on that weight as we move back and forth in front of the work, coming closer and moving further away again. In this case, Fontcuberta's subject is the Earth, a photograph of it as taken from Apollo 17 in December 1972. But the search words that generated this image were heaven, purgatory, and hell, searched for in English, French, and Spanish. Welcome to our planet, says Joan Fontcuberta. Apparently, all is not as it seems, even in a photograph. And perhaps this is the ultimate message of all of Fontcuberta's work, a plea for skepticism and critical analysis rather than passive reception. Turning photography into a question rather than a given, what more could one ask of any curated exhibition of photographic images? My examples have shown that certain artists are already doing the work that curators are struggling to do, making sense of, allowing a grasp of, offering a critical perspective on the torrent of digital images now available on online platforms. At the same time, this kind of work momentarily stabilizes photography's inherent schizophrenia, making the immaterial image a material thing, and thereby ensuring the possibility of a slowed down, more thoughtful perception of the world around us, including the image world around us. Curators often claim not to be artists, to be no more than invisible facilitators of another artist's intentions. But as we've seen, for example, in recent photo exhibitions at Te Papa, among other places, curators do make creative interventions within their exhibitions when it suits their purposes. I'm proposing here that if we are to have exhibitions that engage the contemporary photograph in all its many manifestations, we need curators to adopt the sort of strategies that I've showcased here. They need to become authors, perhaps even auteurs of their own curatorial work. They need to think and act more like artists. Thank you.
Before I start, I just want to make a comment on something Geoffrey said. There never were any national boundaries in photography. They have been imposed by art historians. So I've called my talk Contemporary Photography and Curatorial Practice, both terms in inverted commas. Ka nui te mihi kia katoa katoa, no mai, haere mai, e tēnei rā, ko Peter Island ahu. Welcome. Thanks to the Govett-Brewster for hosting this event, and to Chloe and her team for organising it so efficiently and hospitably. This image from Caroline Boreham's recent State Space series is here simply as my current image of the week. Caroline has done a series of the interiors of prisons, men's and women's, and this appears to be some kind of dining area. My talk is in 4 parts. Part 1. The term contemporary photography is one with a specific meaning when attached to the term curatorial practice. And the first part of this short paper will examine the connection between them, as well as the wider cultural historical context. These days, it's reasonable to assume that gallery and museum curatorial practice is built on the tertiary level study of the discipline of art history. Although art history covers a period of around 5,000 years, its own history is less than 200 years old, and many, if not most, of its bases as a discipline have been shaped by ideas prevalent over those 2 centuries, the 19th century's preoccupation with progress and the 20th reconfiguration by modernism among them. Other shaping non-art factors locally include aspects of New Zealand's own history, such as colonialism, and the relatively recent development in the arts sector of what an optimist would call professionalism and a pessimist might call careerism. It's continually disappointing for an outsider such as me to observe that in a profession apparently trained in critical thinking, the effects of the above factors on curators' perception and curatorial judgments are rarely discussed or even acknowledged. Since our business is largely visual, here's another, perhaps more telling picture. When something in material culture comes along indicating a developmental leap, its embodiment can often, rather comically in retrospect, resemble the old rather than the new. The leap from the cart to the coach was big enough, but they both pretty much moved at the same speed. The advent of the railway engine ramped up the speed issue faster than the technical imagination of designers could move, and it took a while for the necessary streamlining of railway coaches to get sorted. There's an analogy here between art photography, I'll say that again. There's an analogy here between art and photography. Art professionals are still largely occupying the old coaches. And for curators, therefore, the issues are changing perception and gearing up imagination. As a notion, the art part of the phrase art history has evolved without any consideration of the sometimes considerable differences between, let's face it, the medium of painting and the medium of photography. Hence Roland Barthes's observation that photography is haunted by the ghost of painting. Firstly, painting has had a very long history of at least 5,000 years compared with photography's mere 180. Secondly, originally photography was a scientific medium, a state usually assumed to be the very opposite of art. The West's very education system has been based on that difference for at least 2,000 years. No one questions the validity of the phrase the arts and sciences. We're almost hardwired to this distinction. And thirdly, a general perception remains, and very widely, that because photographs are made by a machine, they could not be considered art, the evidence of individual hand being one of art's most respected values. And that's a view more likely to be people, not art curators, I hasten to add. I'm trying to be generous here somewhere. The fact that, say, Schubert's piano sonatas are also brought to life via a machine seems to have occurred to very few. Very soon after the photographic medium's invention in the later 1830s, various non-scientific individuals began attempting an art platform for it, aping current art styles to raise the medium's new status, culminating in an international movement known as pictorialism, which flourished from the 1880s until around World War I, although it continued in a degraded form until at least the 1950s. Modernism despised it universally because of its imitation. It didn't privilege the new, and its lack of technical purity. It didn't honour truth to materials. Classic pictorialism is only now emerging from derision and art historical neglect. Modernism not only accepted its successor, the new objectivity, but fully embraced its practice. This European art movement emerged in the 1920s and flourished until World War II, but it had virtually no impact in New Zealand, apart from perhaps secondarily and rather feebly through advertising styles. The one photographic style to have continuous currency in this country has been documentary. But significantly for this gathering, it was, and perhaps remains, the style farthest removed from any current notions of art. From where it emerged strongly in the 19th century as part of the colonising project, to the decades following World War II when it was characterised by an American-influenced social realism. In terms of prevailing notions of art, the gritty realism of the Burton brothers and other 19th century photographers was up against the woozy, softly lit paintings of late English Romanticism. And after World War II, the social realism of photographers such as John Pascoe, Les Cleveland and Hans Westra didn't stand a chance against the late American painterly abstraction in terms of high modernism's prejudice against any form of realism. An aside. The work of photographers practicing in New Zealand in the 19th century can stand up against any in the world at that time, when the work of artists here at the same time was, and perhaps only could be, a pale reflection of what was being done in provincial England. When will this be recognised by art historians? That's the end of the aside. With the passing of modernism's high-minded and purist ideals from the late 1950s, early 1960s, a new space opened up for a reconsideration of photography and its relationship to art. Then it took at least a decade for current ideas to effectively filter through to New Zealand. So it wasn't until the early 1970s that what could be called contemporary photography as a practice began happening here with a degree of critical mass. Consequently, public galleries in Auckland, Hamilton and Palmerston North began modest contemporary photography collections at the same time as a loosely connected bunch of photographers established the influential body called Photoforum. Generally, until the early 1980s, New Zealand's exhibition and collecting culture remained largely resistant to accepting photography as worthy of its attention. In 1979, a fairly literate regular art reviewer for Wellington's former Evening Post, Neil Rowe, described it as a fad. In 2016, 37 years later, one can only respond, yeah, right. While photography's situation vis-à-vis New Zealand public galleries has changed significantly over the 2.5 decades since, in one very important sense it has not changed at all. Recalling Barthes, notions of art have cast a long shadow over the medium photography, and hence the phenomenon of so-called art photography. Part 2. Here a useful, pertinent, but possibly contentious analogy will be introduced. However uncomfortably, an illuminating parallel from this country's history can be drawn between Pākehā's social-political relations with Māori and the art establishment's current relationship with photography. The pivotal word here is assimilation. Despite the cultural promises in the treaty, once Pākehā population numbers exceeded those for Māori between 1857 and 1858, growing European hegemony brought Māori culture to its knees. And the story for the next century was, brutally, assimilate or die out. The only values that mattered were European ones, and Maori were widely expected to adapt to them. In a parallel and scarily accurate art world situation, the only values that matter are art ones, and photography is expected to adapt to them. Photographers who happen to suit this scenario, or learn to become complicit in it, make what's called art photography. Photography is its own collection of iwi with its own legitimate visual values and modes of expression, and as such deserves the sort of Renaissance Maori art experience from the 1950s, where respect for difference gradually replaced the expectation of dominance. On the 4th of August 1878, the Thames Star reported the death of prominent Hawke's Bay chief Te Hapuku. He had signed both the 1835 Declaration of Independence and the treaty in 1840, and they described him in this way. He appears to have been an admirable specimen of the fine old Maori gentleman, one of the olden time. The fine old Maori was a common later 19th century trope which lasted well into the 20th. The description was code for someone not rocking the boat. Someone who passively accepted the hard particulars of Pākehā hegemony. As a sign of the actual extent of this, the Thames Star report was wildly erroneous. Te Hapaku was in fact, during his life, hugely unpredictable and fairly bolshy, even experienced politicians unable to divine where his loyalties lay, but in death his reputation just had to be anaesthetised for the public record. My analogy ends with the observation that in cultural historical terms, the phrase fine old Maori parallels pretty exactly the term art photography. Part 3. Returning briefly to the issue of the 19th century's idea of progress, how that affected modernism's privileging of the new, and how both of them influenced the development of professional curatorial practice, the very title of the seminar is testament to this Trinity's currency. Indeed, one of the contributors today was described as having an interest in historic photographs and how they function in a museum context. Unintentionally perhaps, but safely corralled away from contemporary concerns. The issue should be how they function in a contemporary context, not a merely confining museum one. And I think your talk today about the Swainson Wood Collection shows the potential of that. There was a moment, perhaps for about 2 decades, during the advent of postmodernism here in the early to mid-1980s, when modernism's concern for the new seemed to be moderated by a fresh interest in history. But that seems to be waning now, as trend-setting art fairs and the auction market become much more focused on the contemporary. And in an almost parallel development, the programs of public galleries seem to be influenced by this trend too. It's a different kind of new, though. Modernism's now was a kind of ideological commitment with an eye to the future. Today's now, by contrast, seems a more practical response to the effect of social media, where attention spans seem to have been dramatically reduced. In such a context, it's not easy to sustain almost any concept of history. But here and now, in Aotearoa, New Zealand, we need to look no further than the Maori concept of whakapapa, how things connect. The question now is, what factors influence curatorial decisions about both what is shown and how it's shown? There is probably a whole bunch of these factors that those in this room acknowledge and can publicly agree on, things like time, money, and fashion. But there are some factors rarely acknowledged and hardly ever discussed, but have as much influence as time, money, and fashion. Another aside, just hold that thought. New Zealand's a small country where everyone knows everyone else, especially professionally, which does have its uses. But New Zealand's also still an insecure culture, and these two aspects combine, along with the scarcity of jobs, to produce a rather conservative, risk-averse curatorial culture. And it's especially unfortunate that curators and what they publish are discouraged from raising issues potentially controversial. This is not a healthy situation in any scenario valuing open debate. The hard facts of employment are, firstly, that there are more people wanting to be curators than there are jobs, and secondly, anyone who secures a job is naturally anxious to get on. At the recent Auckland Art Fair, the 2016 Stand Prize was awarded on the basis of 3 factors, one of which was curatorial sensibility. There's no hard definition of this, but we kind of know what they mean. One of the expectations of new curators is that they learn this on the job. And whilst such knowledge may facilitate continuing standards and encourage team cooperation, it can result in a certain tunnel vision, which tends to reinforce current practice rather than extending its boundaries. It seems the case with the concept of art photography, and in terms of the phrase curatorial sensibility, continued focus on this bogus category begins to look like insider trading. Since the Occupy movement and the GFC, many younger artists are working in areas of social and political concern, areas totally abjured by high modernism. And one only has to look at the lineup for the last Walters Prize to see how widespread this new development is. There has been little acknowledgement by art historians so far. This is exactly what documentary tradition of photography has been doing continuously, globally, and powerfully since around 1890. It may be that the photographic medium is ceasing to be haunted by the ghost of painting and could be doing some timely spooking of art on its own. Looking at and thinking about photography on its own terms, discarding the assimilationist approach, is the challenge for curatorial practice now. For this non-photographer painter, photography has been the most vivid, engaging and stimulating medium for almost 50 years. And this challenge, a wero, since it's Maori Language Week, is also an invitation. An invitation to expose yourselves perhaps recklessly, but more fully to the richest and inexhaustible wonders of this marvellous medium, and discover that in a very real sense, any photographic image is always contemporary. These two images, both from around 1900, may offer an instance of this. And this may seem rather mean, but I'm comfortable with that. Hands up those who know the name of the painter. Okay, what's that, 6 or 7 or 8? Francis Hodgkins. Hands up those who know the name of the photographer. Okay, Josiah Martin. How many of you have heard of Josiah Martin? Well, you know, and you've all heard of Gottfried Lindau, almost, no, well, you're not from here. I mean, you know, I think I've been very heartened today, having written this paper, to see the kinds of things that Daniel and Geoffrey have been talking about, practical contemporary things that extend the boundaries of something I've been talking about. And I'm very hopeful that the degree of pessimism I brought with me when writing this paper has been to some extent dissipated by what has happened today. Part 3. Those of you who attended the symposium at Te Papa last month will recall speaker Ron Brownson offering us a gift from his heart. Well, I'm offering you a gift from my head. And so we'll unveil a simple device which could offer considerable assistance to curatorial practice over the next 2 decades, the penumbra meter. Oh, it's not going to help us, is it? There it is. All right. Well, when you have a concept for an exhibition, you can mentally turn the arrow and find out how far away your exhibition is away from the penumbra of art, photography. All right? There you go. It's been a concentrated day today, and everybody's looking forward to getting home and opening a bottle of something and finding a comfy chair to collapse in. So perhaps this light-hearted device may come as some relief, but it does have quite serious intent. Ngā mihi, thank you for your attention and support.
Peter, let me just begin our conversation by asking you a question in response to your paper. Would the various pessimisms that you expressed, the various problems that you pointed to, be somewhat alleviated if New Zealand, in fact, had a institution devoted, in fact, to photography? Isn't the part of the problem that you're talking about that, for whatever historical reasons, art museums have become the default spaces where the history of photography and the practice of photography is presented? And that comes with all of the things that you've touched on, the sort of art historical prejudices, fashion, the market, the institutional pressure to perhaps not rock boats. Isn't it strange that a medium that has dominated modern life for nigh on 200 years has not, in this country, an institution devoted to its study and presentation? Even Te Papa doesn't have a gallery devoted to photography or a print room where you can go and look. But I mean, even Te Papa, we don't have a photo-specific centre anywhere in New Zealand. Now, why is that?
Well, maybe it doesn't matter anymore, Geoffrey. Maybe it doesn't matter anymore. No, listen, stop interrupting.
I'm always interrupting you.
Can I draw on a biblical precedent, you know?
A biblical precedent?
Yeah.
Oh, God, you have been around a long time.
Now, you know, Jesus didn't keep the disciples in Jerusalem. He sent them out. Ah. Okay?
Yeah, but the moment...
So, no, be quiet. So I think, you know, getting people like Chloe and all the other young curators here, you know, getting them seated with the idea, I mean, you know, this is a bit patronising, but, you know, getting them going is more likely to produce a long-term productive result than finding some site-specific thing to show photography. I think that would be much more effective in the short run.
But what I took
That's
away
why
from
I
your...
put a 20-year thing on my
your
penumbra meter.
thing, yeah.
Yeah.
I can see us being in complete darkness by the end of that period. But isn't...
I'm full of hope after today.
Oh, really? Gee.
We've just got to get some of these guys
You're
back
very
from
easily
Australia.
swayed.
No.
But isn't the problem... I mean, I'm not quite sure how encouraging the Chloe's, magnificent though she is, here's somebody who has a degree in art history, a master's degree in art history. I thought this was your problem, that photography is too often framed by the concerns of art history, and therefore, for example, documentary, and you might say contemporary vernacular practice online,
Well, that's just up to now.
insufficiently dealt with.
But I think things are changing very quickly, as everybody knows. And I think, I think change could be affected more completely and interestingly by young curators working in different institutions and things like this. I mean, we've had 2 photographic symposiums within a month. Well, I mean, that's never happened before.
And 2 major exhibitions simultaneous.
Yeah.
But Peter, is it ever going to happen again?
Well,
when is
I
the
think-
next time a major photography exhibition? I think you said in your review, there's been 3 at Te Papa in 18 years. Govett-Brewster has its commitments, but it's unlikely to have a major exhibition like this for some time to come.
For all my reservations about, I don't want to talk about Te Papa, but I'm going to for a minute because I just think it's a bit unfair because, it's such a lump of a bureaucracy. It just, I said about 10 years ago, not even God could change Te Papa now.
You've been very biblical today.
We've got to. No, I'm not. I'm usually difficult. I think that sort of do-it-yourself New Zealand thing has got to find way. I mean, trying to affect change at Te Papa is just a waste of energy.
Okay,
just let it lumber on doing what it's doing.
But let me get back to my...
Govett-Brewster, here it is, provincial town, they've got a show on here that on the scale of which Te Papa's never had in terms of its genesis and its range. And I don't want to harp on about something like, Tairāwhiti with its Crawford show. I mean, they live on the smell of an oily rag. They've got a small staff and they did this fantastic Crawford show, It can happen, but only in places like that where they've got the DIY approach. And they don't have to, have everything, they don't have to breathe in triplicate, And I think one of the great things I love about New Zealand is that you can make things happen quite quickly. And that's one of my objections to the corporate model. And before it was called Te Papa, when it was Mons, I had a notice up in my room saying monstrous with a Z in it, because I just felt instinctively that as an institution it was completely out of scale with this culture. And 18 years later, do I need any further proof?
So Peter...
No, just leave it. I mean, I encourage them to do better, but I just think in terms of putting energy into anything, go elsewhere.
The question is where the elsewheres are, because as an independent curator, of course, I've been incredibly lucky to score a gig with the Govett-Brewster, but you're only likely to get one such gig in a lifetime. This show, which I'm going to see for the last time tomorrow morning, that's probably it for me in terms of this scale, these resources. But I'll be doing, hopefully, little shows in some of these little spaces that you mentioned if I'm equally lucky.
But, portability is also a problem, I mean, I'm not, licking ass here, but I mean, your Dark Sky show was an absolutely fantastic show.
Oh, thank you.
And it was at the Adam Art Gallery. I mean, it should have gone to the Auckland Art Gallery, It should have been at Te Papa, If they're all so busy at Te Papa, why can't they delegate something to you and actually make something happen? But of course, no, poor Athol. We don't want to flay Athol to death here.
No, I'm not flaying him at all.
No.
But here's the thing,
Peter. It's not really his fault.
Getting back to something that Daniel touched on, are you concerned then when you see an institution like the National Gallery of Victoria doing away with a gallery devoted to photography and, in effect, depowering the curators that used to be specialists in those fields?
If it does mean there are fewer shows, of course I think it's ridiculous and silly and stupid and backward.
But what about the payoff? That photography is finally being shown, as you suggested in your second last slide. Finally, it's being shown next to the paintings where it should be. I mean, isn't that the payoff that you would prefer? We don't need little ghettos anymore.
No,
finally, photography is in the art.
We need both because you may recall when Charlotte Davey opened the symposium at Te Papa. She described the public appetite for photography as voracious. Okay? But we've known that for 40 years. And I think, in a gathering like this, everybody's a professional. And it's hard for us to put ourselves in the shoes of Joe Blow who goes into a museum. And I think it's important to do that. Because, there's a huge, there's a hunger, a public hunger for knowing more about the way photography connects, that whole whakapapa thing. Not only how it connects internally, how our Burton brothers connect with Lawrence A. Bahat or Edith and it does connect with Edith, for God's sake, but how it connects with the wider art thing, how it connects with that, and how hard is that to do? How hard is that to do? I'm not going to let you
Apparently
talk.
quite hard. Quite hard because it's not being done very often. But the other strand I took from your paper was a plea for documentary, or a plea that documentary be taken more seriously.
Well,
the implication being that
recognised.
it's a little unfashionable at the moment and therefore...
Well, it's becoming very quickly more fashionable.
Oh, it is?
And
why
they
is
had
that,
a
do you
show
think?
here when Rana was here. What was it called? Was it called The New Documentary or something? And they carried on as if the documentary tradition had been dead for 2 decades. And I said, no, it's just that you haven't been paying attention. Suddenly it was becoming fashionable
For a
again.
museum, that is a kind of death when you don't pay attention to
Yeah.
it. Why do you think
An
we need to pay
institution
attention?
without windows.
Yes, but why do we need to pay attention to it now in particular, do you think?
Well, for the same reasons a lot of artists, artists, non-photography artists are paying attention to it. As I said, those people in the Walters Prize. People sitting in doorways and, doing all those like Luke Willis-Thompson and stuff, doing those very documentary things. But it's what the documentary tradition of photography has been doing since the 1890s at least, continuously, globally, successfully. And it's, it's one of the greatest single things that photography's given to the world, and, the bloody museum and art gallery world behaves as it doesn't exist. And it's, it's such an incredibly rich, the thing that people can relate to.
You've beaten the drum. You've beaten the drum.
All right. Well,
just for a moment, let's...
when they're deaf and blind, I've got to carry on like this.
Let's come back to my own paper just for a moment before we open it up.
Different.
What about the idea of curating? Because I've spoken to many curators whose mantra is that the curator should be, in effect, an invisible presence, that the proper role of a curator to care for work is to facilitate the artist. And they themselves, they don't sign their work, often their names are not there, that they minimise their creative intervention. Whereas I'm trying to argue that, in fact, curators are always artists, they're always intervening.
I think that's completely a waste of time having to argue about.
Oh, really? But which way are you going then? Sorry, are you for the invisible or for the visible?
No, visibility. I mean,
Visibility.
This thing about authoritativeness. When I did that eye contact review of Robert Leonard's show about Dashford at the City Gallery, and I try not to write about anything other than photography, because I don't want to go there, because I can't afford the lawyers. But I wanted to write about that because Robert had put his curatorial stamp on the show. Every square centimetre had Robert Leonard written on it.
Yeah.
And it gave the show, incredible vivacity and power and, its own kind of authority. And the kind that once you start trying to be authoritative, you become bland. I mean, it's a given. And I don't want to go anywhere and see bland.
So you think
I've got bland at home.
if curators were encouraged to be more like auteurs, to be able to stamp their own individual perspective on an exhibition, they're more likely to come up with the kind of provocations that you're calling for.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, they're human beings. They've got blood going through their veins, most of them. They've got a point of view. They're professional enough not to kind of, run away with the horses. They can be relied upon to, do something.
I see. You mean
if
go
you're a
crazy.
professional, you're capable of trust. And people aren't allowed to do that anymore. They've got layers of managers, sifting through their stuff to see if there might be some offending somebody in Ekatahuna or, somebody's great-grandfather in Russell. I mean,
So
the hell with that.
you're
Be brave.
pro-offence. You're pro-offence, you're saying.
Well, not as such. No. There's no. I mean, that's
Offence with a
childish.
purpose. As Edith says, if
believe
she
in
can
offence
persuade
is
herself it has
childish.
value, then
Yeah,
she's
do
willing
it.
to defend
Do it.
whatever ethical...
Yeah, do it. Yeah.
Conundrums
Have
might
the
have-
courage of your convictions.
Right.
It's hardly an original thought.
It could be an original practice.
Absolutely, I'll drink to that.
Now, as you
Damn,
can
it's dirty
see,
water.
Peter goes back to biblical times and has a very long institutional memory for the history of photo exhibitions in New Zealand, whereas I am more of a neophyte, but we're both available for questions from the audience about anything we've had to say or about emanations or any other exhibitions that people may have encountered.
Before that, can I just make one remark?
You can.
Now, I noticed today, the only time there was a real response from the audience was to Edith's work. When she, no, not Edith, sorry, Edith.
Oh, okay. No offence or anything, Edith.
I could feel the response to Edith's work. Yeah, but the only time there was a palpable response was when we were seeing that stuff, because people could relate to it immediately. And most people would find that difficult to think of as art. And when I saw that photograph of the young skater, I just thought that was as good as anything Renoir ever did. You know, it was just a fantastic image. I mean, just...
But let's talk about curating in that...
Yeah, in that... Yeah.
That problem, right?
But I thought that said something about documentary.
So far, 2 approaches, or 3, you might say. Put them up on social media or in newspapers and get information. Make digital prints and put them up in the gallery and everybody comes, oh, there's Auntie Joan, or let's pick out all the dog pictures. But okay, so far you'd have to say, not very creative curating.
And we're talking about time, money and fashion again.
Oh, we are?
Talk about limitation, that. Yeah.
But I would have said, you said, look, you know, it's New Zealand, it's do-it-yourself, it's number 8 wire, we can do whatever. There's a whole bunch of photographs. What kind of curating needs to be done to take them beyond sentiment and beyond, you know, social information, to make them a provocation? You tell me.
Well, I will. About 4 years ago, Sandy had a show at...
No way.
Oh.
Well, people have to go. Some people need to get to the airport, so I want to...
Oh, you do? Oh, yeah. I didn't realise you were running out of time. Oh, we run out of time?
No.
He needs to thank them for coming.
So, are you going to come? Okay. Yeah. All right. Sorry. It was just to thank the...
Is it possible to curate a collection of 200,000 negatives of studio photographs? Yeah, what would you do?
Well,
we've seen dogs. Let's assume that's one option.
Yeah, I think the curator should look through them, and they could do a number of things, but they should trust their instincts. You know, whatever's there that gives some notion of even a tiny aspect of the collection that will engage people, do it.
But perhaps what we should do is invite artists of the equivalent of Patrick Pound or Schmid or any of these people.
Or work in collaboration with them. I don't want to put them all out of a job.
Well, that's not so bad.
I wanted to say something about Sandy's show at the Adam Gallery of the Victorian one with the albums and cartes de visites and things. Well, you know, a reconfigured show of those with the selfie, because it's about people through photography projecting themselves for different reasons. And that's the carte de visite was a Victorian selfie, and it was really the first time that anybody, particularly less rich people, had a chance to have themselves depicted. And it's a similar impulse, and it's like looking at both ends of a rainbow.
So you like to see conversations between historical material and contemporary material.
So it's a way of refreshing the way of looking at historical photography with a modern medium that everybody knows. And if you just put them in vitrines by themselves, people will just say, "Oh, look, old photographs," and move on. But if you can creatively link them with something, and it's telling you something about both the selfies and the cartes de visite, and bingo. How hard is that?
Sounds like you have an exhibition on your hands.
No, I'm not. No.
Simon, do you want to say goodbye? People have to go to airports, unfortunately.
Yeah. No, it's okay. We'll miss you.
If any of the people who have to leave have a pressing question, now is the time. Daniel, Sandy, who else is on that plane? Edith, you got questions for Peter in particular? Oh, sorry. There you go.
You can answer it.
That was very lovely, Peter, and I had a lot of ideas about that because as an artist I'm somewhat disappointed often by what's on show. And I joked with Serena about taking over a space to do the very thing that I think that you talked about, situating photographs, like the photographs of the studio from Swainson. And I could put that with things that I've been looking at, like Seydou Keita's photographs from Mali. I could situate that studio practice globally and locally, and Why can't we see those shows here? And
It doesn't take much to start a conversation, you know?
yeah, we also have to produce work too as makers. I'm waiting for people to make these things, and I'm waiting, and perhaps I may be at your age to come back and have the very same conversation.
Yeah, okay.
Edith,
Perhaps.
no one is that age. He was there with the Ark.
18,
Shut up.
18 years and 3 shows. Ooh,
Yeah.
I hope that's not.
Well, another interesting phenomenon that's coming lately, in the last 2 or 3 years, is that some dealer galleries like Michael Leet in Auckland are doing historical shows. You know, Two Rooms have done some very interesting photographic shows. Sweet's doing some interesting things, you know. So there's a shift. The more bureaucratic the public institutions have become, you know, this need that pops up is popping up somewhere else in the dealer galleries, and that's a great thing. You know, more is better.
I think that's actually a worldwide trend, because
Yeah.
some of the best shows you see in New York now are at Gagosian rather than at
Yeah,
MoMA.
exactly.
They can afford
Yeah.
to have Monets and God only knows what else in their
And
commercial
they're just
galleries.
freer to do it. They're not tied up with all this bloody bureaucracy.
Well, they're driven by money rather than
Yeah.
more altruistic
Yeah, true.
impulses.
But they're happening there, that's the point, you know. They're happening there, but they're not happening there. Let's go there.
Any other questions
Thank you,
from
Edith.
anybody, but especially the departers? Are you happy?
No, just to thank you and everyone, but also to say, also do I need the mic? Have you got the mic? That I think the level of, despite your pessimism about New Zealand, it seems to me quite a sophisticated, engaged discussion.
And you don't get emanations in Australia, do you?
And we know. So coming
get
from
pathetic
across
collection shows at the NGA and no shows at the NGV.
Well, I don't want to be critical about Australia, but you know, I'm
No, it's okay.
a bit envious right now. So I'll just
Okay.
leave it with that. Thank you very much.
Well, let me, before they depart, just thank our 3 speakers who have to leave for giving very wonderful presentations. So that's a quick burst of applause. So why don't we let them go, because I know that there's at least one woman here who has a question or had a hand up. Yeah, Simone and the woman next to her.
Simone Douglas, is it?
Goodbye, Daniel. Goodbye, Sandy.
See you guys.
Goodbye, Edith.
Okay, thanks very much, Peter. I found your presentation amusing and also troubling, which is, I'm sure, what you were intending. I organised the annual Auckland Festival of Photography, and I was just curious about your lack of acknowledgement of that festival as part of the conversation of New Zealand photography. You mentioned the Auckland Art Fair and a prize that they give around the curation of, I'm not sure what the art form is that you were talking about. I mean, you know, the festival actually does engage with multiple curators. We actually have an international curator here at the moment. I just wondered, you know, particularly given what Geoffrey was saying about where is New Zealand photography going to be based and how is it going to be seen? You know, obviously the festival is one of those key vehicles for it, and I just wondered where that fitted in with, you know, what you were talking
Well,
about.
it's, you know, it's one of the things that's happening, like these seminars. Yeah. How long has the festival been going, remind me?
13 years.
13 years.
A bit longer than the Auckland Art Fair, actually.
Okay. And has it ever invited me to speak?
Okay, there's the real question.
There's a real question. Do you live in Auckland?
I live in New Zealand.
Oh, well, there you go. Good on you.
Thank you. I just thought I'd make that point.
Put his name on the list. Simone, you had a question too, I think. Probably not about the festival.
No, although I am the curator reference there, but the artist curator, I'm not a trained curator. I have so many things to ask, but I guess the first thing I do is want to give context. Apparently I was introduced, or someone introduced me to Sandy as being a local high school science teacher, and I must apologise on all fronts because I am Australian, so that's kind of, sorry for that. And B, I have to apologise to my science teacher who's probably falling off his science stool in his grave, who I'm sure I pushed him towards. And the reason why I did that was because when he asked us to answer what is gravity, and of course we were supposed to fill in the equation, I answered photography, which got me into hot water in science and art and philosophy all at the same time. But anyway, but what I want to say out of that is that I'm really passionate about photography, and I'm so thrilled to see eminence. And I'm a great supporter of photography as an artist, being put into context with other media and other ideas. I love it when my work is curated into shows where it's kind of put in context with other media and ideas. But for me to come into, and I use this word not in relationship to the way Peter was using it, but this cathedral of ideas that you've developed in this exhibition, and how I think it was referenced earlier as being that question of being whether it's contemporary, and I found it so contemporary when I was standing in there. And yet this kind of historical reach right back to the beginnings of the medium itself, if not the idea of the medium. And it made me, and I wrote this to you at the time, and also to Simon, that it made me want to re-engage with photography again. It was all the reasons why I became involved with photography in the first place, and the kind of philosophical premise of it. So I would love to hear from you as the curator, and I agree with you that a really good curator is also an artist. And I really appreciated today that there were artists and theoreticians and curators all speaking in the same day, which was fantastic. But I would love to hear more about your ideas, about how you developed that exhibition and how you brought those ideas together and how you passed your way across 200 years of practice and idea.
Well, in brief, I have, for those who don't know who I am, I lived in the US for maybe 25 years, and as a consequence of that, I had a number of opportunities both there and in Europe to curate exhibitions. So I've done perhaps 4, you might say, substantial exhibitions in various parts of the world. And in each of them, what I have always tried to do, being somebody who in fact specializes in early 19th century photography, but as anybody who teaches and writes about photography knows, you are by necessity turned into a jack of all trades. So of course I also write about contemporary art, and I also write about Alfred Stieglitz and so on and so forth. So in all of my exhibitions, what I've always tried to do is engineer a conversation between historical photographs and contemporary ones, and indeed between vernacular photographs and high art photographs. So Emanations comes at, it's the 4th reasonably substantial exhibition of this sort that I've done, and it follows in the same path. So right from the outset, when Simon invited me, wherever Simon is, to do an exhibition, the way it came about, would I be interested in doing an exhibition at the Govett-Brewster, which of course had just sort of doubled itself and now had a Len Lye Centre, the Len Lye galleries and the old Govett-Brewster. And I said, so what's going to be on in the Len Lye part? And Paul said, we're going to put up all of the Lye cameraless photographs for the first time. And I said, okay, great. I've always wanted to do a history of cameraless photography, so why don't we take that as the kernel and go both backwards and forwards from Lye, and it's as simple as that. The exhibition developed from that basic premise. And as Paul mentioned, the next trick is actually finding things, because if you really want to do an historical show, it just can't be persuasive unless Talbot is there, because he made, as the inventor of photography, a lot of cameraless photographs. Or if Anna Atkins is there, the first person to do a photographically illustrated book, all cameraless cyanotypes. Fortunately, even in the short time I've been back in Australasia, I've discovered that the Auckland Museum has Talbots, just no one's ever exhibited them. The National Gallery in Canberra has Atkins, they have Man Ray, they have Molinage. So it turned out that you could curate maybe 90% of that exhibition from local collections. And so I would say, coming back to Peter's do-it-yourself model, I like to think that Emanations reminds us that in fact we have some very rich resources within reach. And what we really just need is some creative curatorial thinking to bring all those strands together. Of course, we then had the advantage of Simon's fundraising capabilities, and therefore the ability to borrow the Christian Marclays, which have never been to Australasia before, and which everybody who goes to that exhibition won't forget that experience, that they are incredible works of art, incredible photographs, and various other things, the Polish photographs, the Czech photographs, and so on, and the stuff we borrowed from New York dealers to flesh out something of the historical context, especially of mid-century modernism, the period in which Lye is making his work. So that's how it came about. But the basic premise is, just as you said yourself, my own view is that Talbot is a contemporary artist. If you put him in a contemporary context, he still has something to say to us today, as does Atkins and indeed as does Lye. We need to curate with that presumption in mind. I'm really not interested in ghettos in which contemporary art exists separate from these histories. And indeed, anybody who indeed engages in conversation with ambitious contemporary artists knows that now, perhaps even more than in any other period in photography's history, those artists are engaged with the history of photography. there's almost, when you go down and look, say, Justine Varga, a 32-year-old artist, but she's deeply engaged with the history of the materiality of the photographic object and all the histories related to it, as are almost all contemporary artists that I'm familiar with. So artists are looking historically, you might say, their work's engaging with history, and as curators we need to allow that conversation to become visible and apparent to the audiences that come to our exhibitions. So that's the brief. I won't tell you all the things, the disappointments, things we didn't get and we wanted to get, but the show is pretty much an ideal object. Other questions?
All done, are we?
Oh, Paul's got a question. You need a mic, Paul. I'll just make Sarah go up and down the stairs.
Just a general question for you both, given you probably have a very deep interest in this, but publishing around photography, and particularly given the publication that goes with Emanations as a standalone counterpart to what we're doing here, that's really the international audience for the show will see it through the book. And I guess just your thoughts on the health of publishing around photography, given that the role that museums and art galleries take in disseminating photographic works and the decline in publishing, particularly Te Papa Press, things like that. But also, Peter, your interest in the bureaucratic, which is a big hindrance to publishing.
Do you want to go first? Or? Okay. Well, there are several strands to publishing, of course. In some senses, it's easier now because of the technology, and that's why a lot of photographers there's a renaissance in self-publishing. It's really hard to keep up with them, and also they tend to be quite expensive. 100, 200. I paid $250 for Peter Black's second last book. It's quite a lot of money for a book. I'm very glad I have it. So again, it's a bit like the things popping up at dealer galleries. There's people are self-publishing. I think Te Papa Press is a tragic story, but it's part of the larger tragic story of Te Papa, so we'll leave them alone. But I think there's I don't see any lessening off of photographic publishing in New Zealand or anywhere around the world. I mean, it's just a golden age of photographic publishing. But one of the other great aspects of photography is it's always had a very great relationship with the book in a way that other fine arts haven't. So there's a very, they're cousins, and it's great. Yeah, I'm very optimistic about publishing. The only thing I'm pessimistic about is my means to obtain a lot of it.
I do think, again, that we've been singularly blessed in that we've had New Zealand photography collected and Emanations published more or less in the same month, both by New Zealand authors, New Zealand-based authors, both published by New Zealand presses. Plus, we've had The Photograph in Australia, a similarly ambitious book, come out of Sydney. So, yeah, we've been very fortunate. Yeah. So, I mean, I agree with Peter that, it's like an exhibition publishing a book. The same kinds of problems, the same kind of issues. You sometimes strike it lucky. In this particular case, for the Emanations book, I mean, for those of you wondering how come that book is like it is, because of the 25 years invested in the United States, it gives me the capacity to walk into the office of a publisher, somebody I'd never actually met, but I had published an essay in another book that this woman had published, and say, hey, I'm doing an exhibition, and would you be interested in publishing a book in relationship to it? Now, the way publishing works now is, yes, they are interested if I come with money. And when you do an exhibition, one of the, as an independent, one of the things, the advantages is it comes with some money. So you can say to the publisher, the museum doing the exhibition will subsidise the book. Then they're interested because their financial risk is lowered. And then, in this particular case, I said, look, we want this book to be distributed around the world. And so if it was just a kind of catalogue of a relatively local exhibition, it's unlikely that it will be so distributed. So why don't we do an ideal history of the cameraless photograph, which will overlap significantly with the exhibition, but be a separate project, the ideal exhibition, if we could possibly afford it. And so that's what the book has become. Now, the big advantage of that is that that book, as Simon's just discovered, is already in bookshops at the Centre Pompidou and Zurich, and he's just been on a little trip and he's constantly running into that book. That book is going to be a calling card for the Govett-Brewster probably for a decade to come, and indeed a calling card for New Zealand photography, scholarship, museum practice. So the money invested in that book, a relatively small proportion of the money invested in the exhibition as a whole, is going to have a huge flow-on effect for New Zealand artists and curators and scholars. So I think it's a fantastic commitment on the part of the Govett-Brewster to allow, you might say, a separate book, not just an exhibition catalogue. It's a kind of unusual thing to do, but I think it's going to pay off handsomely, yeah, in the short term and the long term. And indeed, just to finish on it, the nice thing about doing it the way that's been done is that here we have a global history of photography that anybody buying it in the Centre Pompidou would say, oh, this is like a global history of photography, without realising that there is unusually a significant number of New Zealand and Australian artists in that book. The first time an international history of photography has ever appeared in which, in fact, any Australian or New Zealand artists have had a place. So here we have a way of insisting that the Pacific have a presence in an international story, while not, presenting it in those terms. You know what I mean? It doesn't pretend to be a New Zealand history of photography. It's an international history in which New Zealand and Australian artists rightly have a proper place.
Thank you.